I found out my parents sold my car on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a normal workday. No warning. No conversation. No question. Just a text message that popped up on my phone while I was answering emails, my coffee already cold beside the keyboard. Good news. We sold the car. Got $7,000 for it. You're welcome. For a second, my brain refused to process the words. I read the message again. And again. Waiting for it to rearrange itself into something that made sense. But it didn't. Car. My car. The one registered in my name. The one I paid insurance on. The one I used every day to get to work. Sold. I felt that strange, hollow sensation open in my chest. Kind that happens when reality shifts too fast for your body to catch up. Like missing a step on the stairs and realizing halfway down that you're already falling. I locked my screen and just sat there. My coworkers typed around me. Phones rang. The office buzzed on like nothing monumental had just happened in my life. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion. How? When? Why? And then, slowly, disbelief curdled into something sharper. They hadn't asked. They hadn't checked. They hadn't even told me beforehand. They had decided. I picked up my phone again and typed carefully, my fingers shaking despite my effort to stay calm. What do you mean you sold it? The reply came almost instantly. You weren't using it properly anyway. And we needed the money. Don't worry, it worked out for everyone. Worked out. That phrase hit harder than the sale itself. Because it meant this hadn't been a mistake. It had been justified. Rationalized. Proved in their minds before I ever knew it was happening. I stood up from my desk and walked into the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. Every step felt unreal. Like I was moving through water. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Images rushed in. Me saving up for that car. Me signing the papers. Me driving it home, windows down, music too loud, feeling, just for once, like something in my life belonged entirely to me. And now it didn't. Another message buzzed in. You should thank your father. He negotiated really well. Most people wouldn't get that much. Thank you. That's when the confusion finally snapped into clarity. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about necessity. And it definitely wasn't about helping me. It was about control. They hadn't just sold my car. They had erased my ownership. My agency. My right to decide what happened to my own property. And then they expected gratitude for it. I realized, standing there in that quiet hallway, that this wasn't the first time something of mine had been taken and reframed as a favor. It was just the most blatant. Car was gone. But what they were really testing was something else entirely. Whether I would accept it. Whether I would stay quiet. Whether I would say thank you for being robbed by the people who raised me. And in that moment, with my phone still glowing in my hand, I knew something irreversible had begun. This wasn't just a bad day. It was the start of a reckoning. By the time I sat back down at my desk, my hands were still shaking. Not the dramatic kind of shaking that draws attention. The subtle kind. Kind you notice only when you try to type and every key feels slightly too far away. I stared at my inbox without seeing any of it. Deadlines. Meeting reminders. None of it mattered anymore. 'Cause my entire sense of stability had just been rearranged without my consent. I kept replaying the text in my head. We sold the car. As if it were communal property. As if it had been sitting unused in a shared garage waiting for a practical decision. As if my life didn't depend on it. I thought about how I'd bought that car in the first place. How long it had taken me to save. How many weekends I'd skipped. How many times I'd said no to small comforts because I wanted something that was mine. Not borrowed. Not shared. Not conditional. That car had been freedom. Not luxury. Freedom. It was how I got to work without asking for rides. How I visited friends without coordinating schedules. How I proved to myself that I could build something independently. And they had taken it. Casually. Efficiently. Without hesitation. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was planned. They had discussed it. Agreed on it. Executed it. All without me. Which meant they never considered my opinion necessary. That realization hurt more than the loss itself. I excused myself from a meeting and stepped outside, the afternoon sun too bright against my eyes. I paced the sidewalk, phone in hand, rereading the message thread like it might reveal a hidden apology if I looked hard enough. It didn't. Instead, there were follow-ups. Be grateful we handled it for you. You don't understand how stressful things are right now. We did what parents do. Parents do. That phrase landed heavily, because it implied entitlement, as if parenthood granted lifelong authority over anything connected to me, as if adulthood were optional. I felt anger rise then. Not explosive. Controlled. Focused. This wasn't about selling a car. It was about redefining boundaries without telling me. It was about deciding that what belonged to me could be reassigned if it served their needs better. I realized something else, too. They didn't tell me beforehand because they knew I'd say no. And instead of respecting that, they bypassed me entirely. Consent had never been part of the equation. I thought about all the other moments that suddenly lined up behind this one. Times when my belongings were borrowed and returned damaged. Times when my plans were overridden because family comes first. Times when my autonomy was treated like a phase instead of a fact. Each incident had been small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I texted back slowly. Deliberately. You sold my car without asking. That wasn't yours to decide. There was a pause this time. Longer than before. When the reply came, it told me everything I needed to know. You're overreacting. We raised you. That car existed because of us. I laughed out loud. A short, humorless sound. There it was. The logic they always used when they crossed a line. If they contributed at any point in my life, they believed they owned the outcome. I leaned against a light pole and closed my eyes. I felt something solidify inside me. Not rage. Resolve. They weren't going to see this as wrong. Not unless I forced the issue. And even then, they might not. But I saw it now. Clearly. They had sold my car. Kept the money. And expected gratitude. That wasn't parenting. That was appropriation dressed up as care. As I stood there, traffic moving past me, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up with better communication. It was a line being crossed deliberately. And once crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. Question was no longer whether they were wrong. Question was what I was going to do now that I finally stopped pretending they weren't. By the third day, the shock had fully metabolized into something colder and far more dangerous for them. Understanding. Understanding strips excuses down to their bones. It removes emotion from the equation and leaves only structure. And once you see the structure, you can no longer be convinced that what happened was accidental. I replayed the sequence again, this time without emotion. They had access to the keys. They had access to the paperwork. They knew my schedule. They chose a time when I was unreachable. They completed the transaction. They informed me afterward. That wasn't impulse. That was strategy. I realized then that the sale wasn't the violation. The violation was the assumption underneath it. The belief that my life, my property, my decisions were still subject to their authority if they decided it was necessary. That belief had existed long before the car. Car was just the clearest expression of it. I thought about my childhood room. How often my door had been opened without knocking. How privacy had been treated as something I earned by being agreeable. How independence had been praised only when it didn't interfere with control. I remembered being told, "You'll understand when you're older." What they meant was, "You'll agree with us when you stop questioning." Except now I was older. And I understood something very different. I understood that their version of love required access. Access to my things. Access to my time. Access to my compliance. And the moment I started asserting ownership, that version of love turned hostile. I checked my bank account that evening. Not because I expected to see the $7,000, but because I needed to ground myself in facts. The money wasn't there. It never had been. They hadn't even pretended it was for me. That realization hit deeper than I expected, 'cause it confirmed what I had been avoiding for years. When it came down to it, my needs were negotiable. Theirs were not. I remembered how often I had adjusted my life to make theirs easier. Driving out of my way. Changing plans. Covering small expenses without comment. All under the assumption that mutual respect existed underneath it all. But respect that disappears the moment you assert boundaries isn't respect. It's tolerance. And tolerance can be withdrawn at any time. That night, I lay awake thinking about what gratitude had meant in my family. It was never a feeling. It was a performance. Something you demonstrated through compliance. Through silence. Through not making things difficult. They weren't asking me to thank them for selling the car. They were asking me to reaffirm the hierarchy. To say, "You decide. I accept." I realized then that the thank you they wanted had nothing to do with appreciation. It was about submission. That understanding reframed every past conflict I'd ever had with them. Every time I'd been told I was ungrateful. Every time I'd been accused of being dramatic. Every time my reaction had been scrutinized instead of their behavior. Those moments weren't about conflict resolution. They were about containment. I also noticed something unsettling. Even now, part of me wanted to soften the situation, to suggest a compromise, to accept a partial apology, to minimize the harm so we could move on. That instinct was deeply ingrained. And dangerous. 'Cause compromise only works when both sides recognize harm. Here, harm was being denied outright. I imagined what would happen if I let this go. If I swallowed it like I had swallowed so many things before. Precedent would be set. My property could be liquidated. My autonomy overridden. My boundaries ignored. And the next time it wouldn't be a car. That thought settled heavily in my chest. Fear tried to rise. But it didn't dominate. Instead, something steadier replaced it. I understood that this was not a situation that required explanation. It required response. Not reactive. Not emotional. Decisive. They had acted as if my adulthood were optional. I was done proving otherwise with words. As part 3 came to a close, one truth stood unshaken. They believed authority was permanent. I had just realized it was conditional. And once that realization takes hold, control loses its illusion. By the time part 4 settled in, my mind stopped circling the car itself and began excavating everything beneath it. Car was only the surface. What lay underneath was years of normalized overreach that I had been trained to call concern, help, or parental right. Once I stopped filtering those memories through loyalty, they reorganized themselves with brutal precision. Events that once felt isolated suddenly connected. Patterns emerged where I had only seen coincidence. I remembered how decisions about my life were often made slightly ahead of me. Not openly. Quietly. Plans adjusted before I was consulted. Assumptions made before I was informed. Conclusions reached before I had spoken. At the time, I thought that was just how families worked. Parents anticipate. Parents guide. Parents know better. But what I was seeing now was something else entirely. They didn't anticipate my needs. They anticipated my compliance. The sale of the car hadn't been an emergency measure. It had been a test. A test to see if I would accept the final authority they still believed they held. A test to see if adulthood in their minds was symbolic or real. I replayed the phrasing of their messages. We sold the car. Don't worry, it worked out. You should thank your father. None of it acknowledged harm. None of it acknowledged ownership. None of it acknowledged me. I realized then that my presence in their decisions had always been optional. What mattered was my reaction afterward. As long as I absorbed the outcome quietly, the process never needed to be examined. That was the unspoken rule. Decisions were theirs. Adjustments were mine. I began to see how often my boundaries had been respected only when they aligned with convenience. When they didn't, those boundaries were reframed as attitude, as selfishness, as misunderstanding. And every time that happened, the focus shifted. Not to what had been done, but to how I responded to it. I had been conditioned to defend my reactions instead of questioning the action that caused them. That conditioning was powerful, kept the system intact. I also noticed how quickly money entered the conversation once control was challenged. Not as transparency, as leverage. They didn't say we needed help. They said we got a good price. They didn't say we should have asked. They said be grateful. Money was never the issue. Authority was. I sat with the realization that if I had reacted differently, if I had thanked them, minimized the loss, accepted their framing, the story would have ended there. They would have taken my gratitude as confirmation. Confirmation that their access was unlimited. That scared me more than the sale itself, because it meant the only thing preventing future violations had been my silence. I thought about how many times I had preemptively softened my own needs to avoid conflict. How often I had told myself, it's not worth the fight. How many boundaries I had negotiated down to suggestions. Those compromises hadn't kept peace. They had only delayed escalation. Car was proof of that. I imagined what would have happened if I hadn't pushed back now. If I had accepted their authority as intact. I could see the future clearly. More decisions made on my behalf. More justifications. More expectations of gratitude. I felt something harden then. Not my heart. My clarity. I understood that this wasn't about reclaiming the car or the money. That battle was already lost. What I was reclaiming was the definition of ownership itself. Ownership of my life. Ownership of my decisions. Ownership of my boundaries. And ownership, once claimed, doesn't need constant defense. It needs consistency. I realized something else too. They weren't prepared for resistance. Not real resistance. They expected discomfort. They expected complaints. They expected emotion. They did not expect refusal. Refusal doesn't argue, doesn't persuade. It doesn't perform. Simply stands. As part 4 closed, I felt the old fear loosen its grip. The fear of being too much, of being labeled ungrateful, of being seen as difficult. Those labels had power only when I accepted their definitions. I no longer did. Car was gone. But the illusion that they still controlled my life was disappearing too. And unlike the car, that loss was irreversible. By the 5th phase, the situation had moved beyond shock, anger, or even realization. It entered a territory that felt unfamiliar and deeply unsettling to anyone who had benefited from my silence. It became non-negotiable. What I was confronting now was not an action that needed to be undone. It was a belief system that had finally been exposed to daylight. And belief systems do not survive exposure very well. I started to see how authority had been maintained in my family not through explicit rules but through emotional conditioning. No one ever said, "We own your things." They didn't have to. They had taught me to internalize that message long before adulthood. Ownership was allowed as long as it didn't conflict with their needs. Autonomy was encouraged as long as it remained symbolic. Independence was praised only when it did not interfere with access. Once independence became inconvenient, it was reframed as disrespect. That realization made me revisit every moment where my boundaries had been overridden for my own good. Times when my preferences were dismissed because they didn't align with what was easier. Times when decisions were made quickly so I wouldn't have time to object. Times when the phrase "we thought you'd understand" was used to erase my consent retroactively. Understanding arrived slowly, then all at once. They had never been confused about my boundaries. They had simply never considered them binding. The sale of the car was not an overstep in their minds. It was a correction, a reminder, a reinforcement of hierarchy. And that was why gratitude mattered so much to them. Not because they wanted appreciation, but because gratitude would have restored the order. It would have confirmed that their authority was intact. I noticed how their language shifted the moment I didn't comply. The warmth disappeared. The justification hardened. Concern turned into irritation. "You're being dramatic. You don't see the big picture. We did what was necessary." Those phrases weren't meant to explain. They were meant to close the conversation. What unsettled them most was not my anger. They were prepared for anger. They had strategies for that. What unsettled them was my refusal to engage on their terms. My refusal to argue inside their framework. My refusal to accept their definition of reality. I stopped responding immediately. Not as punishment, as choice. That pause changed everything. It removed the rhythm they were used to. Quick justification. The emotional reaction. The eventual softening. Without that rhythm, their messages began to feel hollow, repetitive, defensive. I realized then how much power I had unconsciously handed over by reacting quickly in the past. Speed had been mistaken for honesty, urgency for sincerity. Slowing down was not avoidance. It was control returning to its rightful place. I also began to feel something unexpected. Not relief. Relief implies escape. What I felt was sovereignty. A quiet recognition that my life did not require their approval to move forward. That my decisions did not need their validation to be legitimate. That my boundaries did not need to be explained to be real. This was not rebellion. It was separation. Separation is different. Rebellion needs an enemy. Separation needs only clarity. I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't trying to force an apology. I was simply no longer available for a role that required my self-erasure. That realization came with grief. Not loud grief. Quiet grief. Kind that acknowledges something has ended without needing to dramatize it. I grieved the idea that my parents would ever see me as fully autonomous without trying to reclaim control. I grieved the fantasy that fairness would matter more than hierarchy. I grieved the belief that love alone could override entitlement. Letting go of those fantasies hurt, but holding on to them had cost me far more. As Part 5 settled into place, I understood something irreversible. There was no version of this where things went back to how they were. And that was not a failure. It was a correction. Car was gone. The money was gone. But something else had returned to me. The authority over my own life. And unlike the car, that authority could not be sold, taken, or reframed as a favor. By the sixth stage, the conflict was no longer confined to messages or memories. It had begun to reshape the landscape of my life in real time. Consequences of my refusal were unfolding quietly, methodically, and with a clarity that left no room for denial. First thing that changed was the tone of communication. Not what was said, how it was said. Messages became shorter, colder, transactional. Gone was the assumption that I would soften the edges for everyone else. Gone was the expectation that I would absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That absence unsettled them more than any argument ever could. I noticed how quickly my parents shifted from confidence to irritation once they realized I wasn't chasing resolution. They had expected resistance. They had expected emotion. They had expected me to protest and then eventually relent. What they hadn't anticipated was disengagement. Disengagement is dangerous to systems built on control because it removes the fuel. There is nothing to argue with, nothing to negotiate, nothing to dominate. I stopped replying immediately. Not to punish, to think, to choose my words with intention rather than reflex. That simple shift altered the balance of power. I could feel it in their responses. Questions disguised as accusations. Concern that sounded suspiciously like surveillance. So, what are you planning to do now? You're being very distant lately. We're just worried about you. Worried. That word had always been used as a shield. A way to re-enter my decisions without permission. A way to reassert access under the guise of care. This time it didn't work. I realized then that my parents had never actually been afraid of me failing. They were afraid of me not needing them. Need creates leverage. Independence dissolves it. The more I stood in my autonomy, the more their reactions revealed themselves as attempts to regain footing. Not to repair the relationship. To restore hierarchy. I also noticed changes outside the family. At work, I was more decisive. Not because I felt braver, because I felt less fragmented. I wasn't carrying the constant background noise of appeasement anymore. That freed up energy I hadn't realized I'd been spending for years. I made choices faster. I trusted my judgment. I stopped second-guessing myself after every decision. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was alignment. I also began setting boundaries that had nothing to do with my parents. Saying no to favors that drained me. Declining conversations that felt invasive. Ending explanations when they stopped being necessary. Those boundaries held. The world adjusted. That taught me something critical. Catastrophic outcomes I had feared were largely imaginary. The real cost had been internal all along. As the days passed, the silence from my parents grew heavier. Not empty. Loaded. I recognized it now as a familiar tactic. Withholding warmth to provoke self-doubt. Waiting for me to break first. But I didn't. Instead, I sat with the discomfort. I let the silence exist without trying to repair it. I allowed myself to feel the grief without translating it into apology. That was new. And powerful. I also revisited the idea of gratitude one last time. Not the weaponized version they demanded. The real kind. I was grateful for the clarity. Grateful that the violation had been so undeniable I could no longer rationalize it away. Grateful that the illusion had broken completely instead of cracking slowly over decades. Sometimes the most painful events accelerate growth you would otherwise postpone forever. Car was gone. But so was the last excuse I had been using to stay small. As part 6 came to rest, I understood something deeply sobering and deeply freeing. They could no longer hurt me in the way they used to. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I no longer mistook access for love. I no longer equated compliance with connection. I no longer believed that being taken from was the price of belonging. The system had lost its grip. Not with a fight, with a refusal. And from that point on, nothing could be taken from me without my consent again. By the time Part 7 took shape, the conflict had fully detached itself from the original event. It was no longer about the car, not about the $7,000, not even about my parents' audacity. It had become about something far deeper. Who I was when no one was watching. Who I was when I wasn't being evaluated, corrected, or quietly managed. For the first time in my life, I noticed how often my internal dialogue used to sound like my parents' voices. Not loudly, subtly, in tone, in judgment, in expectation. You should be more understanding. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Is this really worth damaging the relationship? Those thoughts had never felt foreign. They had felt responsible, mature, reasonable. Now I recognize them as inherited restraints, internalized controls that kept me aligned with a system that benefited from my restraint. Once that recognition landed, it changed everything. I began separating my own values from the values I had been taught to prioritize. Not by rejecting everything outright, but by examining each belief carefully. What did respect actually mean to me? What did family mean when stripped of obligation? What did love look like without leverage attached? Those questions didn't have quick answers. They weren't supposed to. I spent evenings sitting with discomfort instead of distracting myself from it, letting emotions rise without immediately categorizing them as wrong or excessive. Anger didn't scare me anymore. Sadness didn't require explanation. I realized how often I had tried to be emotionally efficient, compressing feelings so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. That habit had cost me depth. Now depth was returning. I noticed how my body responded to this internal shift. My breathing slowed. My posture changed. I stopped clenching my jaw without realizing it. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were quiet signals that my nervous system no longer felt under constant threat. The silence from my parents continued. But it no longer felt like punishment. Felt like confirmation. Confirmation that my presence had always been tied to performance. That access had been conditional. That compliance had been mistaken for closeness. I didn't feel triumph about that realization. I felt clarity. Clarity allowed me to grieve honestly. Not the relationship as it was, but the relationship I had hoped it could become. I grieved the idea that my parents would one day respect my autonomy without trying to reclaim it. I grieved the fantasy that fairness would override control. I grieved the belief that if I explained myself well enough, things would change. Letting go of that fantasy was painful, but holding on to it had been far more damaging. I also noticed something unexpected. Without the constant emotional pull of my family, my life expanded. I had more energy, more focus, more presence. I stopped bracing for impact, stopped scanning conversations for hidden expectations, stopped preparing defenses for conflicts that hadn't even happened yet. That mental quiet was not emptiness. It was space. Space to choose differently. Space to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Space to define myself without reference to someone else's disappointment. I began investing that energy deliberately. Into friendships that felt reciprocal. Into routines that supported my stability. Into goals that were mine, not reactions to someone else's pressure. I noticed how differently people responded to me. Not because I had become harder, but because I had become clearer. Clarity doesn't invite negotiation. It invites adjustment. Some people adjusted. Others didn't. And for the first time, I didn't chase those who couldn't meet me where I stood. I also recognized how power had shifted internally. My parents no longer occupied the highest authority in my mind. Their disappointment no longer dictated my behavior. Their silence no longer defined my worth. That was not rebellion. It was maturation. True adulthood, I realized, isn't marked by independence alone. It's marked by the ability to tolerate disapproval without self-abandonment. As Part 7 settled fully, I understood something irreversible. Even if my parents never acknowledged what they did, even if they never apologized, even if they never changed, I would still be okay. Not because I was numb, but because I was whole. The system that had once relied on my compliance had lost its most important component: my participation. And once participation is withdrawn, control has nowhere left to land. By the time Part 8 unfolded, I understood something that would have terrified me months earlier. I was no longer waiting for anything. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Not a moment where they would suddenly realize how far they'd gone. That waiting had been the last thread tying me to the old dynamic. And without it, everything felt different. For the first time, my choices were not reactions. They were origins. I noticed how my days began to reorganize themselves. I woke up without the familiar sense of bracing. No mental checklist of emotional risks. No quiet calculation of who might be upset by my decisions. That absence was startling. It revealed how much of my mental bandwidth had been consumed by vigilance, by preparation, by the constant effort to stay ahead of disappointment that wasn't even mine to manage. I began to see how deeply the invisible contract had governed my life. Contract that said, you are allowed space as long as you don't challenge authority. You are allowed independence as long as it remains symbolic. You are allowed ownership as long as it can be overridden when convenient. Selling my car without asking had violated that contract so blatantly that it could no longer hide. And once exposed, it collapsed. I realized then that my parents had never actually believed they were taking something from me. In their minds, they were reallocating a resource they still felt entitled to manage. The problem wasn't cruelty. It was entitlement so normalized it didn't recognize boundaries as real. That distinction mattered. 'Cause it meant nothing I said would have changed their behavior. You can't argue someone out of a belief they don't realize they're holding. I stopped framing the situation as betrayal. Not because it wasn't one, but because that framing still centered them. Instead, I reframed it as revelation. A revelation about how power had always flowed. About how my adulthood had been conditional in their eyes. About how ownership had been symbolic rather than respected. That reframing didn't soften the impact, clarified it. I also noticed how my sense of identity shifted when it no longer needed to be defended. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't narrating my decisions. I wasn't seeking agreement to validate my reality. I existed without commentary. That might sound small. It wasn't. For years, my sense of self had been reactive, shaped by response, defined by contrast. Now it was internally referenced. What feels right? What aligns? What protects my integrity? Those questions guided me more reliably than any external approval ever had. I also began to understand how much grief I had deferred. Not loud grief, quiet grief. The grief of realizing that some relationships are limited by design. That some people cannot meet you in mutuality because they require hierarchy to feel safe. I let myself mourn that honestly, without rushing to forgiveness, without framing it as growth. Just loss. And something unexpected happened. The grief didn't weaken me, grounded me, anchored my boundaries in reality rather than anger. It ensured that my distance wasn't performative. It was necessary. I also recognized how often society encourages reconciliation at the expense of self-respect. How frequently family is used as a reason to tolerate what would be unacceptable anywhere else. How easily boundaries are labeled as cruelty when they disrupt entitlement. I rejected that narrative entirely. Choosing myself was not abandonment. It was correction. I didn't stop loving my parents. I stopped allowing access without consent. That distinction mattered deeply. I could hold compassion without proximity, understanding without submission, memory without obligation. That balance felt mature in a way compliance never had. As Part 8 settled fully, I felt my life stabilize around something solid. Not approval. Not reconciliation. Not resolution. Alignment. My actions matched my values. My boundaries matched my needs. My silence was no longer fear-based. It was chosen. Car was gone. The money was gone. But the illusion that my life required their authorization was gone too. And that loss, unlike the others, felt like freedom. By the time Part 9 took form, something irreversible had already happened inside me. I no longer measured progress by how little something hurt. I measured it by how much it no longer controlled me. The situation with my parents had stopped being an open wound. It had become a reference point, a line in the sand between the person I had been trained to be and the person I was choosing to become. For the first time, I understood that power does not announce itself loudly, settles quietly, changes posture, not volume. I noticed how my decisions stopped carrying emotional footnotes. I wasn't asking myself how this would be received. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in advance. I wasn't bracing for backlash that might never come. That mental shift freed an enormous amount of energy. Energy I hadn't realized was being taxed every day. I began planning my future without factoring them in at all. Not out of spite. Out of realism. I looked at my finances with new clarity. Not through the lens of what if they need help or what if they disapprove, but through sustainability. Through independence that wasn't symbolic. Through security that couldn't be negotiated away. I set goals that were boring in the best possible way. Emergency savings. Long-term investments. Stability that didn't depend on anyone's mood. That practicality felt revolutionary. I also began revisiting old memories with new eyes. Moments that had once confused me now made sense. The subtle dismissals. The way my achievements were acknowledged briefly and then redirected towards someone else's needs. The constant framing of my independence as nice but unnecessary. I saw now how those patterns had prepared the ground for what happened with the car. This wasn't an anomaly. It was consistency. Understanding that didn't harden me. It relieved me. Relief comes when confusion dissolves. When you stop asking why people hurt you and start asking why you stayed available to be hurt. That question was uncomfortable. But it was honest. I realized how much of my identity had been built around being reasonable, being flexible, being the one who didn't escalate. Those traits had been praised as maturity. But in practice, they had functioned as permission. Permission for others to overstep. Permission for my boundaries to be tested repeatedly. Permission for my autonomy to be treated as optional. I stopped offering that permission. And here's the thing no one tells you. When you stop offering permission, people who benefited from it don't ask what changed. They accuse you of changing. That accusation came eventually. Indirectly. Through relatives. Through half-phrases. Through concerned tones disguised as care. You seem distant lately. They're worried about you. Families go through misunderstandings. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't explain. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. With them. That restraint wasn't passive. It was deliberate. I had learned that clarity doesn't require consensus. And boundaries don't need applause. I also learned something else. Distance reveals character. Without my constant availability, patterns shifted. Conversations became shorter. Contact became less frequent. Interest became conditional again. That wasn't painful anymore. It was informative. I adjusted accordingly. I began surrounding myself with people who didn't require me to perform for belonging, friends who didn't interpret boundaries as rejection, colleagues who respected autonomy without needing explanation. Those relationships felt different, not intense, stable. There was no constant recalibration, no fear of saying the wrong thing, no hidden ledger of favors owed. I realized then that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of manipulation. And once you experience that difference, it becomes impossible to unsee. As Part 9 settled fully, I recognized the final shift. My parents no longer occupied the role of authority in my internal hierarchy. They were people. Flawed. Limited. Capable of love but not stewardship. That realization wasn't cruel. It was accurate. Accuracy allowed me to interact without illusion, without expectation, without sacrifice disguised as virtue. Car was gone. The money was gone. The old dynamic was gone. What remained was something far more durable. A life designed with intention rather than reaction. A future anchored in self-trust rather than approval. And for the first time, I wasn't rebuilding after loss. I was building from foundation. By the time Part 10 began, I realized that what I was doing was no longer healing. Healing implies returning to a previous state. I wasn't returning anywhere. I was becoming something new. The old version of me had been shaped by adaptation, by learning how to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold me fully, by adjusting tone, expectations, and needs to maintain access. That version no longer existed. I could feel the difference in how I moved through the world. There was less urgency in my decisions, less emotional bargaining, and less fear of what this might lead to. I wasn't anticipating fallout anymore. I was living in alignment. That distinction mattered more than I'd ever expected. I noticed it first in small, almost invisible moments. Choosing rest without guilt. Saying no without softening it into a joke. Making plans without mentally checking who might disapprove. Those moments stacked. Quietly. Relentlessly. They created a new baseline. I also noticed how my sense of responsibility shifted. For years, I had carried emotional responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine. If someone was disappointed, I felt accountable. If someone was upset, I searched for my role in it. That reflex dissolved. I still cared. But I no longer confused care with compliance. That change was profound. It meant I could feel empathy without surrendering ground. I could understand their perspective without internalizing it as truth. I could acknowledge pain without assuming obligation. This was not detachment. It was discernment. I also revisited the story my family had always told about me. The responsible one. Flexible one. The one who didn't need much. I saw now how that story had served them. Framed neglect as independence. Framed entitlement as trust. Framed my resilience as permission. I consciously rejected that narrative. Not by arguing against it, but by refusing to live inside it. I stopped minimizing my needs. Stopped presenting self-sufficiency as a shield. Stopped proving that I could survive with less. Survival was no longer the goal. Stability was. And stability requires ownership. Of space. Of time. Of decision-making. I built systems around that ownership. Financial systems that protected my autonomy. Emotional systems that limited exposure. Practical systems that reduced dependence to zero. Each system was a boundary made tangible. I also confronted something uncomfortable. The part of me that had equated endurance with virtue. For a long time, I believed that staying through harm made me strong. That tolerance was maturity. That loyalty meant absorbing impact without complaint. I saw now how that belief had been cultivated. 'Cause endurance benefits those who apply pressure. Strength, I learned, is not about how much you can carry. It's about how clearly you can say, "This is not mine." That clarity changed my posture toward the past. I no longer revisited memories to reinterpret them kindly. I revisited them accurately. Accuracy brought relief. I could name moments as unfair without justifying them. I could acknowledge loss without rushing to forgiveness. I could let disappointment exist without converting it into growth language. That honesty stabilized me. I also noticed how my parents' absence became predictable rather than painful. The lack of initiative, the sporadic check-ins, the vague messages that avoided substance. Those behaviors no longer triggered longing. They confirmed boundaries were working. 'Cause when access is removed, intention becomes visible. I didn't need confrontation to understand that. Silence told the story clearly enough. I also recognized that my life no longer paused for potential reconciliation. I didn't leave emotional space open just in case. I didn't delay decisions waiting for alignment that might never come. I moved forward anyway. That forward motion wasn't dramatic. It was steady, deliberate, unremarkable in the best way. I planned trips without informing anyone, made purchases without explanation, made commitments based on desire rather than approval. Each action reinforced the same truth. My life was no longer negotiable. As Part 10 settled fully, I felt something solidify beyond doubt. Even if they showed up tomorrow with regret, even if apologies were offered, even if accountability suddenly appeared, the dynamic would not revert. 'Cause I had outgrown the structure that required my diminishment. Car had been taken. The money had been misused. But the deeper extraction had failed. They could no longer claim my adulthood. They could no longer rewrite my boundaries. They could no longer access me through guilt. What I had built could not be sold, transferred, or overridden. And for the first time in my life, my future felt untouchable. By the time Part 11 began, the transformation was no longer something I was actively doing. It was something that had already happened. Quietly. Irreversibly. I didn't wake up one morning feeling triumphant. There was no sense of victory. No dramatic closure. What I felt instead was absence. The absence of tension. The absence of second-guessing. The absence of that familiar inner pressure that once pushed me to justify myself even in my own thoughts. That absence was not emptiness. It was space reclaimed. For the first time, my mind was not rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Not drafting explanations for people who had already decided not to understand. Not negotiating internally about how much discomfort I should tolerate to preserve an image of family unity. The mental noise was gone. And in its place, something far more powerful had emerged. Neutrality. Neutrality doesn't sound impressive, but it is the end state of manipulation. I realized that my parents no longer had emotional leverage because I no longer assigned them authority over my internal narrative. They could be disappointed. They could be confused. They could even be angry. None of that required action from me. That realization changed how I remembered the past. Memories that once carried emotional charge began to reorganize themselves. I no longer relived moments from the position of the child inside them. I observed them as an adult with full context. I saw how predictable the patterns had been. How often help had been offered only when it came with strings. How frequently my autonomy had been treated as temporary. How consistently my needs had been reframed as inconveniences. Those memories no longer demanded emotional response. They offered information. Information is power when it's no longer tied to hope. I also noticed how my body responded to this cognitive shift. My shoulders no longer carried weight unconsciously. My breathing no longer tightened when my phone buzzed. My stomach no longer dropped at the sight of their names. The nervous system always knows before the mind does when danger has passed. I began to trust that signal. I also became aware of something else. I had stopped explaining my family situation to others. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed explanation. I wasn't trying to justify distance. I wasn't seeking validation for boundaries. I wasn't narrating pain to make it real. It was real because I lived it. That internal certainty changed how others interacted with me. People sensed it. They didn't push. They didn't pry. They didn't suggest reconciliation as a moral obligation. Boundaries spoken internally don't need constant reinforcement externally. I also reflected on how power truly functions within families like mine. Not through overt abuse, not through cruelty, but through normalization. Through small, repeated dismissals that teach you your needs are optional. Through praise that rewards self-erasure. Through narratives that frame control as care. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you can't go back to participating without awareness. I realized then that my parents didn't lose control the day they sold my car. They lost it the day I stopped trying to make them understand why that mattered. 'Cause control relies on engagement, on reaction, on emotional supply. When that supply is cut, control has nothing to attach to. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing access to my inner world. That distinction mattered. I could still feel compassion without vulnerability. I could still acknowledge history without reopening wounds. I could still exist in proximity without surrender. Those boundaries were not walls. They were filters. Only what respected my autonomy was allowed through. As Part 11 deepened, I recognized something profound. I had outgrown the role I was assigned long before I understood it. The role of the accommodating child. The reliable one. The one who absorbed impact quietly so the system could continue uninterrupted. That role no longer fit. And roles that no longer fit do not require explanation when they are discarded. I also accepted something that once terrified me. That my parents might never acknowledge what they did. That there might never be a moment of accountability. That closure might come without conversation. And that was okay. Because closure does not come from others changing. Comes from you no longer needing them to. By the end of Part 11, one truth stood unshakable. They could no longer take anything from me. Not my time. Not my resources. Not my sense of self. The most valuable thing they once had access to was my participation. And that was gone. By the time Part 12 arrived, there was nothing left to resolve. And that was the most unexpected outcome of all. For most of my life, I had believed resolution required conversation. Apologies. Acknowledgement. Some shared moment where the truth was spoken aloud and mutually recognized. That belief kept me tethered far longer than I understood. What Part 12 revealed was something far more difficult to accept, and far more liberating once I did. Resolution does not require participation from the people who caused the damage. It requires consent from the person who was harmed. And I had finally withdrawn mine. I wasn't waiting for closure anymore because I had already stepped past the point where their understanding mattered. The story no longer needed their version. No longer needed balance. No longer needed fairness. Needed finality. That finality didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as integration. I could hold the entire history without flinching. The good memories and the harmful ones. The moments of care and the patterns of control. The love that existed and the limits it never crossed. All of it could coexist without confusion. That integration changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the person who went through something. I was the person who understood what happened and adjusted accordingly. That distinction is subtle, but it defines adulthood at its highest level. I noticed how rarely my parents crossed my mind now, not because I was suppressing thoughts, but because my life no longer revolved around their gravity. They had become peripheral figures in a story that no longer centered them. I built a life where nothing required their permission. Not symbolically, not emotionally, not practically. Every choice I made reinforced that reality. Where I lived, how I spent my money, who I allowed close, what I tolerated. I no longer confused familiarity with safety, or history with entitlement. That shift protected me more effectively than confrontation ever could have. I also recognized something profound about forgiveness. It is not a moral obligation. It is a personal decision. And sometimes neutrality is healthier than absolution. I didn't forgive them in the cinematic sense. I didn't absolve or excuse. I simply stopped carrying the weight of their actions as something that required emotional processing. The lesson had been learned. Pattern identified. The boundary enforced. Nothing more was required. I also realized that independence is not the end goal. Integration is. Independence is external. Integration is internal. Integration is when your values align with your actions. When your boundaries match your needs. When your identity is no longer reactive. By part 12, I wasn't proving anything. Not to them. Not to myself. I was living. Living without emotional audits. Living without inherited guilt. Living without the quiet fear of being reclaimed. Car they sold was never just a car. It was proof of how easily my autonomy had once been overridden. But the life I built afterward could not be touched. No asset could be taken. No boundary could be crossed. No role could be reassigned. 'Cause the final thing I took back was authorship. I was no longer a character in someone else's family narrative. I was the author of my own. And authors do not need permission to end chapters. They simply turn the page.